On the morning of June 17, 1775, British General William Howe stood on a warship in Boston Harbor and stared at something that had no business being there. Overnight, a colonial militia had thrown up an entire fortification on the Charlestown Peninsula, directly across the water from the heaviest concentration of British power in North America. Cannons, earthworks, and timber walls, all raised in total silence, while the Royal Navy sat less than a mile away. By every reasonable calculation, crushing it should have taken an afternoon. 2,000 trained professional soldiers against farmers and shopkeepers carrying hunting muskets. Nobody on either side yet knew that by sunset, that hillside would be soaked with the blood of more than 1,000 British soldiers, and the survivors would carry that day with them for the rest of their lives. Boston that spring was an odd kind of siege. The British Army held the city itself, redcoats drilling on the common, warships commanding the harbor, checkpoints choking every intersection, yet they could not leave it. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord that April, thousands of New England militiamen had poured into the countryside ringing Boston. Farm boys, apprentices, even old men who dug muskets out of storage from the French and Indian War. They camped in Cambridge and Roxbury and picked off any British patrol that strayed beyond the city limits. The most powerful army on earth was trapped inside a port town by men with no uniforms and barely enough powder to fill their cartridge boxes. Hoping to break the deadlock, General Thomas Gage received reinforcements in May. Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, 3 seasoned officers with a plan to seize the high ground at Charlestown and Dorchester Heights and shell the rebel camps into scattering. Word of that plan leaked to the colonists, as most secrets did in 1775. On the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott marched roughly 1,200 militiamen out of Cambridge to occupy the peninsula first. Ordered to fortify Bunker Hill, Prescott instead pushed his men onto the smaller, more exposed Breed's Hill, closer to the harbor and certain to provoke a response. It looked like a minor adjustment. It changed everything that followed. Through the night, the men dug a roughly 130 by 80-foot earthen redoubt with 6-foot walls, extending fortified lines and a rail fence stuffed with hay to guard their flank. All of it built in near total silence. No fires, no lanterns, just whispered orders and shovels working soft soil under a warm, still sky. At one point, a dropped shovel struck a rock and the whole crew froze, certain the clang had given them away, but the ships at anchor never stirred. Somehow the entire British fleet failed to notice. At dawn, a lookout aboard HMS Lively finally spotted the new works and opened fire, but naval guns firing uphill mostly sailed over the walls. The colonists kept digging. In Boston, the generals argued over what to do. Clinton wanted to land troops behind the rebels and cut off their only escape route across the narrow neck, trapping them without a fight. Howe wanted something more direct, march straight up the hill and break the rebellion spirit with a textbook bayonet charge. Gage backed Howe. Around 1 in the afternoon, longboats began ferrying redcoats across the harbor, each man loaded with roughly 60 pounds of gear. Wool uniforms soaking up the June heat as they formed up on the beach at Moulton's Point. Watching the lines assemble below, Prescott knew his men were short on ammunition. Some carried barely 15 rounds. Others had packed their muskets with nails and scrap metal, and had never faced a real bayonet charge from trained infantry. So he gave the order that outlived him. Hold fire until you can see the whites of their eyes, then make every shot count. The first British line advanced through waist-high grass, officers walking ahead with swords drawn, gold trim catching the sun. At close range, the colonial volley tore the formation apart, officers dropping first, whole ranks collapsing into the bloodied grass. The attack broke and streamed back downhill. Howe reformed his men and sent them up again. This time, Colonel John Stark's New Hampshire militia, waiting behind a stake driven 40 yards from their fence line, cut the advancing British down in rows once they crossed it. 2 assaults, hundreds of casualties, and the colonists still held the hill. Clinton rode over roughly 400 Marines and reserves to reinforce the battered lines, and Howe tried a third approach. Drop the heavy packs, narrow the attack to focus on the redoubt itself, and close the distance fast without stopping to fire. This time, the colonists' ammunition ran out mid-fight. Men loaded their last cartridges with shaking hands, then threw rocks and swung muskets like clubs, as the British finally poured over the walls into brutal, smoke-blinded hand-to-hand fighting. Inside the chaos, Dr. Joseph Warren, a key architect of the colonial resistance, fighting that day as a volunteer rather than commanding from the rear, was shot in the head and killed instantly. With no ammunition left, Prescott ordered a retreat across the neck to the mainland. The British held the hill by late afternoon, but the cost was brutal. Of roughly 2,200 men in the assault, over 1,000 became casualties. 226 dead, 828 wounded, with some regiments so gutted they had to be merged just to function. The colonists lost around 450, including some 140 killed. General Clinton wrote that night that it had been a victory too dearly bought, warning that one more like it would leave Britain with no army in America at all. Howe himself was never quite the same. Officers who served under him later said the slaughter on that hillside made him chronically cautious, and the pattern showed for the rest of the war. At Long Island in 1776, he had Washington's army cornered against the East River with no way out, and instead of pressing the attack, he paused to set up a formal siege, giving Washington time to ferry 9,000 men across the river through fog overnight in one of history's great escapes. At White Plains and Germantown, Howe again pulled back from blows that might have ended the rebellion outright, as if he could still hear what disciplined infantry sounded like walking into massed musket fire. The deeper damage was psychological. Before that afternoon, the British assumed colonial irregulars would scatter at the first real fight. Afterward, they knew these men would hold a dirt wall, aim for the officers, and keep fighting with rocks once the powder ran out. Word of the battle spread through the colonies not as a defeat, but as proof that the Empire's soldiers could be hurt badly. When George Washington, freshly appointed commander of the Continental Army, heard how the militia had stood through 3 bayonet charges, he reportedly said he was satisfied. The raw material for a real army was already there. It just needed organization and discipline. For the British, the math was equally sobering. Every soldier lost had to be replaced by ship across an ocean voyage of 6 to 8 weeks, while the colonists could simply recruit from the population standing on their own land. The battle nudged British tactics away from frontal assaults toward flanking maneuvers and naval pressure for the rest of the war. One footnote rarely makes it into the story. The battle is named for the wrong hill. The actual fighting, redoubt and all, happened on Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill sat further back on the peninsula and only saw fighting during the retreat. The name stuck regardless, the way these things often do once a story has already spread. Today a 221-foot granite obelisk stands on Breed's Hill in Charlestown, marking the opening pitched battle of the Revolution, the spot where colonial farmers first proved they could stand against the British Empire's best soldiers. Britain technically won that hill. It buried its dead, tended its wounded, and counted what the afternoon had cost. Then it spent the next 8 years discovering it could not actually afford the kind of war that victory had just revealed. Because a hill won at half a man's army is not really a victory at all.